Inference, a podcast covering the intersection of AI and games. Today, we're covering creativity in games and the role of AI in it. This is yet another playful creation episode, and we're seeing a trend.
Yes, today we have the pleasure to speak with Brendan Mulligan and Dave Lieberman, co-founders of Liminal Experiences. They got their start with this studio in 2022, and they're preparing their first game release, which is Liminal Skies, a creativity game featuring player-designed AI-powered characters. Previously, Brendan was director of corporate development at Riot Games, giving him a unique view on the strategic investment side of the industry. Prior to Liminal, Dave led engineering teams and engineering strategy at a number of startups and established firms, including Riot Games and App on Board. Dave and Brendan, it is great to see you again. I'm so glad we finally got you on the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much for having us.
So, during Tech Week, Brendan, I got to see your Liminal Skies demo. It looks very nice, very cool. But I really like the way you described it as a tiny glade with people. And do you want to tell us a little bit about Liminal Skies and what you guys are working on?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an internal design principle that we used for one of our milestones, our ambitions for the game. I describe Liminal as an AI storytelling platform. Our goal is to give a space for everybody to tell their own story. And so for us, when I think about what we want to achieve with creativity in games, like for me, the essence of creativity is play. Liminal creation is the game. It's not a vibe coding tool where you're doing work in a tool and making an experience for somebody else to play. You're with your friends in a 3D multiplayer environment, messing around, goofing off, making a story that you can tell with your friends. The idea for us is maybe the simple way to explain it is kind of like you want to be able to build your own episodic Ocarina of Time. Before we had Tiny Glade with people, the first most Uber for X type pitch for Liminal was Mario Maker for Zelda. For one of our more recent milestones, if you're starting from the very basics of what this place is, what should it feel like for this kind of first demo that we're releasing? We really admire the team that made Tiny Glade. They did an awesome job. Every interaction in that game feels incredible. I highly recommend the experience if you haven't checked it out. But it does fundamentally limit itself to the physical built world. We are excited about the idea of saying, what would it look like to bring this world to life? What would it look like to add people? A lot of our early AI experiences are built around this idea of adding characters to the world, giving them personalities and backstories, and then bringing them to life primarily through movement and dialogue.
Nice. So one quick reaction there is that I really like Tiny Glade. I've played some of it. And in general, I really like terrain games or playing with terrain. There's this new game, I think, called Terra Firma, where you create the terrain, but then you let erosion and the effects of nature shape the terrain.
Yeah.
One of the things I keep thinking is when you go to a city, there's the on-purpose modifications of that terrain. And then there's the things that emerge from the interactions of the inhabitants, the weather, climate, and all these little systems interacting with each other, right? So when I go to a new city and I look at all the artifacts, I am playing myself what has been happening here to create that space. And I wonder if that's the feeling you guys are trying to go for. Tell the story with the terrain, but through all of these smaller elements.
Yeah, one thing you're pointing to, and this is a tension we've felt at Liminal since the beginning, is the difference between narrative storytelling and simulation. We feel this with our characters all the time, and I think characters and terrain are both examples of this. Is if you look at The Sims, and again, Sims is a great reference for us. We're incredibly inspired by a culture of Maxis and what they believe about creativity. You look at those worlds, there's an author for the world in the sense that you're God and you can push on the scales at any moment. But really what you're doing is setting things in motion. You're winding up the digital toys and letting them go. You get to witness that and observe as that kind of, it's almost like human erosion, right? There's this process that's taking place,
right,
and you're observing it on the tail end. And a similar thing happens when you look at terrain. Do we want extremely realistic terrain systems? This is a common approach to making good procedural generation worlds. You start with a bunch of rules, and then you say, how does the world fall out from those rules? I think where we tend to lean is a little bit more like in the world of film and television, which is realism's not the point, right? If you've seen any of the pictures that come out of the Chris Nolan's Odyssey, the nerds like me are like, that's not what Roman soldiers were wearing at all. Nobody cares, right? What matters is that Matt Damon looks cool and we're all going to go see the movie. Because our target audience is storytellers, they are trying to get across a concept, a feeling, a world very character-centric things in a very high authorial intent. For them, what matters is that there's a hill with a tree on top to bury the treasure chest under, not that 7,000 years of erosion made that hill and 6,000 years of forestation made that tree. And we always are trying to find that balance of realism and authorial intent. Honestly, I think for the playful audience, we tend to find that it's more fun to just focus on that top level feeling. It is always interesting to look at some of the technology and be like, what if we could just erode that river, and that would feel so, there's a tension there.
Yeah, this is one that I felt, because I, as a player, really enjoy those deep simulations. I find it very interesting to discover what happens in a simulation. That does not always make an engaging game. A lot of game design is really around trying to understand, what does the player have control over, what are their goals, everything else.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering then, so part of the reason we're talking here a little bit, the introduction of AI in there, does that change any of this equation for you guys, or is it basically the same thing?
To the point you were talking about around the terrain and whatnot, player expression is not a new gameplay concept. What feels really new in this case is, in a creation game, how do I express myself? What does player expression look like when I'm holding the paintbrush and painting the picture? I think that's very different when we talk about a very narrative open world RPG, for example, when it's not the paintbrush, it's the storybook. This is a big difference where we think about how AI plays an important role in what it means to hold the paintbrush. If creation is the form of player expression, it's hard to express yourself. It's hard to sit down and give a good speech. It's hard to write a book. I know what's in my head. I know what I want it to look like. The steps in between can be pretty ambiguous. So I think this is the way, to us, it's a big factor of how do we enable player expression. It's in a different dimension than we're typically used to seeing in games. I don't actually think, when you look at the core fundamental, when we're looking to build a game, is like, we want gameplay. The gameplay looks different, but it should feel like a game. It should feel like gameplay and follow many of the same principles. I think if you look at a lot of the tech demos that came out of AI integration with games, hey, I can have infinite dialogue, or the sort of pen and paper RPG aspect that got added. Like, I can go talk to the guard and tell him, hey, isn't it time for your bathroom break? And then he walks away and I can break into the safe. There was that excitement around the pen and paper part of that, but it's not real gameplay. There's novelty behind it, but if I can solve every problem in the game by telling bad guys, isn't it time for your nap? And they go to sleep, that gets boring really quickly. It's not gameplay. So I think the focus for us is really on, what does the gameplay look like in terms of creativity? And even internally, where is it hard to do those things? Where do we think we can raise the floor of what people are building? How can we help people express themselves in that gameplay? And then see what sort of supporting tools or gameplay elements we can add that enable that.
What do you think is this paintbrush? What do you have in mind should be the paintbrush?
Yeah, I think it's important when we talk about AI and Liminal to understand like why we're building Liminal in the first place and what role AI plays in that process. We never set out to build an AI game. We set out to build a great creativity experience for players and use AI where possible to make that game better. We have a very strong stance that AI in games or elsewhere is going to be most valuable when it's very human-centric. My kind of dystopian nightmare is the Wall-E scene where everybody's got their own customized view screen and nobody's sharing in either the creation or consumption of these experiences because we all have a customized story feed for ourselves. What's more interesting to us in a world where content does become commoditized because these tools are so good at making so much content is understanding who made the content and what story were they trying to tell and why is that interesting. And then a step beyond that, what other people are moved by that experience and what does that mean about what you share with that other person in the world and how does that bring you closer together and connect you. My background coming from Riot, I could go anywhere in the world and if I was wearing a League of Legends t-shirt, I would bump into somebody else who loved League of Legends and that was a bond that brought us closer together because we had something that we both shared. And we want that same experience for the stories that are being told on Liminal, that 10 years from now when we're the next big thing and people are creating these stories all over the world, that I could enjoy a story and somebody in Mexico City or in Tokyo could enjoy that same story and that would bring us closer together as people. And the AI is just there to enable those outcomes. It's not, oh, AI is hot right now, let's go make a game with AI. That was never that interesting to us. So when we talk about the paintbrush, it's less of a single interaction. It's less, oh, hey, we figured out this new model and you can type in X and it'll make you a whole game. We've seen some other people do that and raise a lot of money to do that. We actually are not that compelled by that experience. It's more for us, for the nerds who are Legend of Korra fans from the Avatar universe. There's this great character in the show. He's like this industrialist, and he's got this really wonderful assistant. And every time they're out doing something, he just says, "Julie, do the thing." She always knows exactly what to do, and it always solves the problem perfectly. And that is internally the model we have for how the Liminal Concierge should work. The Liminal Concierge being like our collection of AI and proc-gen tools, which is that it's not that there's one way to tell it, hey, I'm typing into a prompt or I'm clicking this button or I'm doing that, but that in any part of the creative flow, you should be able to stop and ask yourself, I'm feeling stuck. Is there something that AI can help me with here? One small example of that is if you're writing a line of dialogue and you're stuck on just that line, rather than typing like, hey, write me new dialogue, you can just, it's a video game. There's a dialogue box over the character's head. You can hold down the control key and click on that dialogue box. And instead of the normal process, which is you'd click on that box and the cursor would show up and you could type something, by holding down the control key, you're saying, hey, can you do this for me? And it's a series of those seamlessly built into what would otherwise feel like a normal video game, something like Tiny Glade or Minecraft. It's a series of those choices that we hope keeps players in a place of flow and making something that feels unique and special to them as creators.
Yeah, I want to look at this interplay between creation and play a little bit more, that, as Ramon said, is a theme often. So if we even look at the history of game development broadly, a lot of it has been advancing the type of creations we can make, how realistic they are, the kind of stories we can tell, the experiences we can deliver. On both sides, what it means to make a game has expanded on the AAA side. Games have become both more and less accessible in their development. On the one hand, you have AAA games that require significant investment, specialized skills. On the other hand, there's another theme there that not everyone needs to get down into the assembly level and be an artist and an engineer, designer, one man, one woman kind of team the whole way through, right? So we look at the way in which, and maybe you have other examples you'd like to look at, like Roblox makes it more accessible. But I like to compare Roblox and Minecraft in that the creation in Minecraft tends to be in the game in a way that Roblox isn't quite in the game. And I think we've talked to some other guests, and Ramona and I definitely have talked about this, is that there's a way in which we can make the medium of the game itself even more malleable by the introduction of additional tools, of which generative AI is one.
I could talk about this topic for the next hour, but I think that this distinction between Roblox as creativity and Minecraft as creativity and how AI sits across them is really important for the industry. And we are often, by our investors, they'll be like, oh, you're building the next Roblox. And we're happy to let them use that phrase. Roblox is a very successful business. In terms of what they're thinking, which is, this is the thing I'm going to get rich off of. Yes, we are building the next Roblox. Please give us money so we can continue to chase the stream. But from the perspective of the player experience, we much more think of ourselves as building the next Minecraft. When you look at Roblox, and I'm a huge fan of what they've done, so that none of this is meant as criticism, but their platform very much is a developer tool suite. It is a separate executable. They call their users developers, right? Every noun and verb in that ecosystem is development language. You are deploying code, a language that describes that ecosystem. It tells you a lot about how they view what they do there. And then there's this verticalized platform where they've got all these players, and those players are customers almost the way you can be a customer on Steam. This is a storefront where I go, it's got my friends, it's got all those things. And they own both of those sides of the relationship, but they're very siloed and independent. And so as much as they talk about we've made it easier, we've lowered the bar, we've got young people making things, I think that's wonderful, they're still doing it through the language of developers. That is fine and obviously has been very successful for them, but fundamentally does constrain the audience. 15 years old and you're not the type of person who's going to grow up and be a computer science major and you just like telling stories with your girlfriends after school, the way they talk about creativity on Roblox might not appeal to you. Whereas Minecraft is pretty much for everybody, right? Like it really is the modern version of Lego, like the 1 to 99, like any age, any gender, any background, you can play Minecraft and never identify as a gamer. That type of user interaction model really changes the expectation of who will be participating. And our goal, and I think the real beauty of AI, to your point, Aaron, is that AI changes who's allowed to participate in the creative conversation. right?
Yeah, because I just think of all the folks, and my son, when he was younger, was one of them, who start to realize that games are a thing that you can make. They like video games. They're like, I want to make a video game. I'm sure many of us have had this conversation where someone is, I want to learn how to make a video game. And then you're like, okay, let me sit you down and we're going to learn how the C+ compiler works.
Right.
And it's just like all the
exactly.
joy just gone. Now, of course, there's all sorts of ways. These days, you'd be like, okay, let's go and make in Minecraft. I usually like point young aspiring game developers and designers to Minecraft or Roblox to be like, look, go in there and make something, start little and go. But even then, with the tools we have, that barrier of I've got an idea to I can now share it is massive. And I do think that one of the potential applications and opportunities for us is making that more accessible. I'm not sure when we'll get to the point that I could just say, make me this game, and it just appears, because that's not only very difficult, but also you'd be like, it's not really that game, it's this game. So there's something in there, but just even how hard it is to interact with that medium. Like, what's the interaction points? How well do I understand it? How well does it respond to me? Is something that I think is going to be very exciting going forward.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of prior art here, and I think you can start nibbling around the edges to see where Liminal is trying to be. You mentioned at the beginning of the episode, prior experience of mine was working on App on Board, which was a no-code game engine. And we could say, hey, that's moving farther from the Roblox developer experience, a little bit farther from UEFN, which are these creator-centric platforms, like you said. And what we learned towards the end of my tenure is the IDE in a lot of ways is the big barrier. The minute you put a development environment, you're fundamentally saying this is a tool for programmers. Programmers make that tool because it's the tool they use every day. And I always used to laugh to say, hey, if I wanted to make a no-code game engine, like Excel might be a better interface for that, because Excel is really complicated, but everybody knows how to use it because there's like a job requirement for it. And so there's this interesting space where you're like, okay, I've got these full-blown engines. I've got a Roblox, UEFN. Okay, we've got this no-code game engine. It's still a really high bar to make something. And then on the bottom end, like you said, there are things like Minecraft. I can make a lot of really complicated, cool things. There's still something missing between what I get from these other products. And I think that's where Liminal is really striving to be. The question is, how are those gaps? Like, where do we modulate between those two and fill as much of that space as possible? In my head, the easiest way to describe how will procedural generation, how will AI orchestrating procedural generation, can I say, I want my tree to be bushy? You don't have to know what model parameters I need to edit to get a bushy tree. That's the space I think we really want to fill. And I think that's the space of opportunity where I can create things more complex than I have the immediate knowledge to do it. And the tools themselves don't imply a level of inherent complexity. The minute I give you an IDE, I've implicitly said you need to be a developer, even if the tool isn't for software development. And that's those sorts of interfaces. Again, we could have very complex interfaces in any game. I could slap something really complicated on top of Minecraft to let you make more things. I am implicitly saying you need a level of professionalism at that point. That's the piece we really have to stray away from and find a way to make sure if creation is the game, it has to stay in the game space.
Yeah, I want to go beyond what Dave just said. I think he's right on all counts about the future of these tools. But even more than fulfilling this need, Aaron, okay, you have an aspiring game developer. How do you start them early? I want to go even farther. I think the real outcome dream for Liminal is that we'll actually psy-up a bunch of people into making great games without them ever thinking they wanted to be a game developer, right? I think by the time you answer the question of somebody who says, I set out to create a video game, what's the lowest friction path to that? You're already implying there's a job to be done and work to do, and maybe identify as somebody who plays games. I love games. And the reality is that's still a relatively small percentage of the population. The example I always use is Final Cut Pro was amazing for democratizing video. And YouTube is one of the greatest things I think ever happened to humanity, right? Just the information sharing and what it empowered people to do. What took video as a medium from the world of nerds to the world of culture is TikTok, right? It never tried to say, we're going to teach you to be a video editor. We're going to teach you to make films. We're going to teach you to make educational videos. It just said, go dance with your friends and be goofy with the camera in your pocket. It was just a game, a toy. All the great things in the future start as toys. The motivation to arrive in that ecosystem was never the outcome or the skill. The motivation was and then people, I think, almost like accidentally discover that, oh my God, making videos and telling stories is really fun. And then some of these people grow up in that ecosystem and they become great storytellers. Our dream is that while there will be many ways to make great 3D interactive content with AI tools, I don't think Liminal is the only path. I would like our path to be what I think The Sims was for a generation of game developers. I think this is particularly true among women, where I talked to a lot of women in the games industry. I'm like, where did you get your start? And they're like, oh, well, I played 5,000 hours of The Sims between the ages of 13 and 25. It made me realize storytelling in video games is really fun. Maybe I should go do this. Like, I think that kind of concept of restrict away any sort of preconceived notion of I'm trying to make something. Strip away any preconceived notion of I have to have a job that I'm training for, and just say, in your heart, there's a desire to be creative. You can give a 6-year-old crayons and they will draw on the wall immediately, right? What is it that we are offering to that individual that makes them show up passionate and excited to create with their friends? And if some percentage of them end up learning, oh my God, I just learned that I'm able to create whole worlds and stories, and one of them goes off and then makes a major franchise, incredible, right? But that approach is much more appealing to me, inspiring people through new ways of being inherently creative than a rigid path of, oh, first you'll do this, then you'll learn Lua, then one day you'll be on Unreal, and that's the path to pro.
So I like this remove the immediate paywall or tax of you have to be a pro mentality. And I like how you lined up the Final Cut Pro, YouTube, TikTok sort of path that happened in video. I presume that you put yourself in the analogous version, but in video games. What I see though is there is, in that trajectory, a change in production, but also in consumption, right? The way that videos were being consumed also changed. That played a big role in people feeling okay to do something. A big part of TikTok's success was just, this is just a platform for, you don't have to be professional. In fact, being professional is probably bad. It's just, you have to be silly.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that's
musically.
what's welcoming.
Yeah,
like where
exactly. And I think that is true for AI games as well. When we sat down to build Liminal, the idea was never literally let's build Mario Maker for Zelda. Like we think that making Zelda is not the point. We actually said, what can we learn from these other mediums? Some people very literally in the AI era were like, we'll make TikTok for games, we'll make 5-second slop that you flip. That's not compelling to us either. But the idea of what do we know about ecosystems that were previously dominated by professionals that are now open to amateurs? How do they create? What does that look like? How has that historically evolved? An ecosystem we look to a lot is the fan fiction community, which is how have they been self-publishing? They very often do one chapter at a time. If you go to AO3 or Wattpad, it's amateurs who come home from work on Thursday night and they write a chapter or two. They post it. Maybe 3 people, if they're lucky, ever read it. They come back a week later. They do this for a few years. This is how 50 Shades of Grey happened. It's just somebody who's learning how to be a writer by engaging in a universe they were already obsessed with in the Twilight universe. She's writing all this great fan fiction. She's developing an audience. She's developing her skills. And at some point she goes, oh my gosh, I've got so much world built and an audience. What if I turn this into something for myself? And she made 50 Shades. So for Liminal, we were always really from day one going after an episodic model where you could create individual levels in game parlance, but really episodes from a storytelling perspective. That has a ton of benefits from a design perspective as well. For you guys, designing open world games where there's new progression, unlockable items is very difficult and not something that necessarily appeals to our audience. But the idea of I can create a scene, I can set up that scene, everything that's going to happen in it, I can go explore that world, and then when that space is finished, I'm ready to move on. I can go to the next scene, to use Ocarina of Time because it's just such a load-bearing concept for everybody in the audience. You could very easily tell that game episodically. You could go make the Kokiri Forest, and then a week later come back and make the Dooku Tree, and then a week later come back and make Hyrule Field, and that world would unfold in a way that was really satisfying, and it allows for much lower times to feedback, right? Anybody creative knows it's really hard to stay motivated for 9 months if nobody's ever seen it, but if you can make an episode in a weekend and share it with the world, even if only a couple of people watch it, that can be exciting and give you the motivation to do the next episode. Over time, we think that's how these stories will build. But to your point, it's very much represents a difference in the way these stories will be consumed, which we think is really good for the industry, because if you're somebody like me who's okay, I loved Horizon Zero Dawn, this is amazing, good luck. in 8 years, when the sequel comes out, you can have more. That goes to your point about how expensive games are to make. The amateur UGC version of storytelling in games will, by definition, be very different. We think that we're building that approach.
I love this because when ChatGPT came, the first thing I did is I started writing tons of fan fiction in the world of the Elder Scrolls. So I was doing like this Civil War and Morrowind, and it was very episodical, in part because that's context windows and whatnot. But it was also, for me, it was easier to think of it. This is a scene, this is what happens. And then there were, in my mind, there was all of these connections and repercussions of what happened in this scene. It allowed me to be much more creative, or gave me much more leeway to set up the other scenes. I really vibe with that. I also like what I'm hearing implicit is that the consumption will also be episodic. I create my scene or the equivalent of a game of this fanfiction scenes, and then other people will just play through it or experience it. What I don't know is how does that look like? Someone creates a specific episode or a small episodic version of a game. How does that play out? How does this look like in reality?
This is where I'll have to be honest and say where we are today versus where we have a vision of. It's much more of a loose story. The scenes are all set on a little sky island, hence the name Liminal Skies. Generally speaking, we see people take very loose approaches where they can either say, hey, here's a set of tasks and you've gone and completed those tasks and here's episode 2 and it'll advance the story. Or they can say, hey, I decorated the world for Halloween and if you come back next month, it'll be decorated for Thanksgiving, and there's some different environmental storytelling. It's up to the creator to decide what they want that progression to look like over time. But the end goal that we've always had in mind that we're still working towards is very much to go back to that Ocarina of Time touchstone. I made this new thing and I go on my Twitter and be like, hey guys, come play my experience on Liminal. It's about this little boy and he finds a fairy and you're trying to understand what's going on in the world. You'd go into that space and you'd have a little quest log and you play through and you get the Deku's shield and you get the Kokiri sword and Milo gets out of the way and then you can talk to the Deku tree, end, right? And your friend's like, this is sick. And you're like, cool, come back next week. Hopefully I'll get done with work and I'll be able to post another one. I think the nice thing is all of these things are well understood behaviors. Like any other platform, I can subscribe to my favorite creator, get notifications when they post new content. And just like you get with the storytelling, people on YouTube use Minecraft as a storytelling tool all the time. Next Sunday night, there will be another episode. People tend to understand when things are coming. A huge reference for us early on was Critical Role, right? Like they really understood intuitively that this new medium can allow us to transform D&D into almost like a television must be there at this date and time kind of TV series. And we think that those same types of behaviors will be very easy to copy over in game consumption.
Yeah, I want to talk about this potential changes to the content, the player experience, and its implications to the industry. Because JM&T, we've had some similar ideas when we looked at, Retail Mage is just a first step towards a series of experiences we want to build. And we've tended to be very focused on session-based experiences, not just because they're easier to build in many regards. We could get to the technical side of why that may or may not be the sweet spot for some of the generative AI, but also some of the consumption patterns. At the time, Baldur's Gate 3 had come out, and I would tell folks, like, sometimes what I want to do is I want to play like a night of Baldur's Gate 3 with my friends, not sign up for a month or a year of things, because I love that game and I would love to play that game. And I'm still stuck in Act 3, actually, because I set it down and I haven't picked it up in 2 years.
This is my experience with playing Digital Frosthaven with my friends. We schedule one night, we never get back to it.
My wife and I were playing Baldur's Gate 3 before our firstborn was born in September, and it's impossible. It's just like too much. Like,
so
okay.
There will still be a place for those type of experiences. Of course there will be. But there's also a place for session-based games. And those session-based games don't have to just be like playing Arc Raiders right now as a session-based game. On that kind of episodic experience, that is something we've seen too. I'm wondering, though, that has two implications, what you guys have talked about. One is, do we expect to see more of this shorter form of games? Is that the trend? As game creation becomes more accessible, we will see an explosion of the amount of content. There's more YouTube video than I think humans could ever actually consume. There's something exciting, but also scary about that. Like, we have a lot of content already as a player. Right? Is that the problem that needs to be solved? I don't have anything to play. That's probably not the problem. How do these things come together?
Yeah.
So what's the What do you feel the impact is to the game industry? What are you seeing as you think the future will be? I'm just curious how your crystal ball looks.
I think you're exactly right that we'll see more and more shorter consumable bite-sized content, and there will be more content than any human can ever consume. I think in games we're probably already there if my Steam library is any hint, right? Like I don't have any belief anymore that I'll ever get through all of them.
There's this problem too
Go ahead.
about like you're now competing against the history of games. Like we're remaking games from 2005, which were great stories, and nobody wants to play them because they don't meet the graphical quality. I can hire artists to redo all the models and textures and play the original Half-Life remastered. This is a great game with a great story. So this problem is only going to get worse over time. All the things Brendan was just saying, we're competing against the last 20 years of games as well as the next 20 years of game. This is a problem which is just going to get way worse, and for good reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I think is nice is that we can look at the other mediums where this has already happened, right? Games, as much as we're all afraid of this, in some ways we've been very lucky. Games are so hard to make, and they take so many resources, and it's been the last medium to have this happen to it. But this has already happened in music. This has already happened in film. This has already happened in text for sure. You look at everything that's been written about the downfall of the journalism industry, and what is essentially I think happened anytime that you get an explosion in who's allowed to create and who's allowed to distribute. What I think Ben Thompson calls a smiling curve, which looks like a U shape on a graph. There's a lot of value on the far left, aggregating all of these short form things. Like TikTok's a great business. It's a great business to be in. There's a lot of value on the right. If you're Disney, you're having 50% of all of the net profits in the films industry go to Disney every year because they're really good at making very big, expensive things. I have no reason to believe the games industry will be any different. It's not to say that Liminal will make these short form things and thus we will not have Grand Theft Auto, right? In fact, it's almost always those will get more expensive because the way they differentiate against the middle is by consolidating more and more resources. You should expect those to get more and more expensive the way that film did, while the middle gets hollowed out.
The double A.
I think this follows trends. This should not surprise us. But what I think is it's very easy to get doom and gloom about this because so many people are impacted. It's a real challenge to the way we've made games before. But the flip side is incredible. Having a radio show used to be very expensive and limited, and that meant there were not many interesting types of radio shows. You'd get in the morning and it'd be like, here's the one about sports, here's the one about pop culture. Now we all get to spend our morning talking about AI and video games because podcasts said we can do this, and if 11 people in the world are interested, it's enough. And I think that is the thing that is so beautiful about the internet. It opens up this long tail where you can then find your niche. So you might have fewer businesses that are able to grab a big chunk of the massless middle that differentiated content is going away. But what's left is 1 to 5 people making something that 10,000 people think is the best thing that's ever been made. And it spoke to them in a way that nobody else ever could. And we would hope, and I think it's almost necessary to be true for Liminal to be successful, that at full scale, people will tell stories in games you could never otherwise tell. Like how many RPGs right now are being a samurai in Japan? Or there's just only so many stories that you can afford to spend $500 million a year on, right? But there's so many stories that you can afford to spend a weekend on. And that should be the benefit that makes us all feel good about these changes. The professional making of games will be in a major disruption period, but the outcome should be that we're all getting much more highly tailored, beautiful content that really speaks to us and allows us to connect to others. I think that's a beautiful thing that I'm really excited about.
Yeah, you can continue to look at the trends of games which are popular. And I think going back to like, how does AI change this? There was this notion for a little while when like GPT-3 came out of the 2-person startup, that there are a lot of businesses which were no longer possible because the cost of hiring 10 people makes the overhead consume all the possible profits. But if you can now have 2 people with the support of some AI tooling run that business, it becomes valuable. And I think we are seeing a little bit of that games, but it doesn't necessarily even have to be that black or white. You look at Blueprints, single developer for 13 years makes this really awesome game. What if it only took him 8? Because there was better support for game making in the things that he struggled with. And that doesn't even necessarily have to be vibe coding. Obviously, he knows enough to make a game. What if the hard parts he could get some assistance with? I think the 2-person startup idea is a little aggressive for games, but this idea of just because we lose some of those AA space today, we don't necessarily have to be so grim about that. I think there's the opportunity to share the paintbrush in ways that say, okay, I can't afford to have a 20-person art team, but maybe I don't need a modeler. Maybe I can figure out how to use these 3D Gaussian splat modeling tools to get good enough.
Yeah.
Can I get to early access and then get some money to hire a real modeler because I've got a proof of concept and made a few bucks and that's where I want to spend my money? I do think there's opportunity for us to be optimistic in that middle piece and just have more democratization of the content in Liminal and elsewhere, because there's not quite this heavy demand of creating a 30-person team for any interesting project.
I often think that this is one of the biggest blessings, right? People complain, oh, this is going to take artist jobs, or this is going to take this profession fill in the blank job. And what happens is AI tends to be fairly mediocre or sometimes good enough if you prompt it with enough anger. But what has happened is you can now, if you're an artist, you can probably you don't have to hire as many programmers, or maybe not at all. And vice versa, if you're a programmer, you can focus on what you're actually passionate and what you're actually really good at. So that becomes your age. So maybe what I'm excited about is if you're an artist, we're going to see much more artsy games, because that's what this person is going to want to polish and make it shine. And everything else is just going to be scaffolding to portray that part. And in your case, when you talk about stories, maybe all they care is about the story, and the rest of the game is just a medium or a vessel for that story. So we'll get very nice polished stories because the people who are building them are like people who are naturally innate. What they want to do is storytelling. And then there'll be like Factorio, which is just targeting the nerd by nerds for nerds mindset. I am curious though, because you did touch on similar industries that have gone this trajectory. And I often think, like, one thing that I tell friends is that, are we the music industry trajectory or are we the video industry trajectory? Because they're not the same. Video went through YouTube, TikTok, and then went through this evolution where it ended up really exploiting that long tail, very personalized, complete revolution. And music, and if you look at video consumption, it grew in economic terms and in total, and it's just like huge thing, right? Music, on the other hand, it peaked with Britney Spears and Backstreet Boys.
I just learned a lot about you, Ramon.
Yeah, it's not about perfect. There is correlation, but that's what the graphs say, right? So it peaks with the music industry. Actually, I think it's related to the CD because it was such a great high margin thing.
I think they've actually come back now. I think the music industry's at high net profits now in history, but there was a post-CD hangover that was brutal to the industry.
Okay, so maybe I have outdated graphs, because if I remember, it comes up, but it never reaches 2000 levels. Aside from the graph, it's not like we have super personalized niche music. The extent of my personalized music consumption is I look for covers of people on YouTube for music that is fairly popular, that I like. But it's just a take on otherwise pretty mainstream music. Maybe SoundCloud would be the closest to the counter to what I'm saying. But the extremes are there, like the two paths are there, right? Music plateaued in the most optimistic sense on growth, and it never went through this super long tail type of content, and video went the other way.
I think the distribution is the difference here.
I agree. I think some of it is, I'm going to speak a little bit outside of my expertise, but my impression is just how the controls of those distributions were, like how accessible it was. Now, it might be something inherent to the medium. We could say maybe there's ways in which the video medium is just fundamentally different as a medium and what the consumption patterns are compared to music. But I also think distribution is a big part of it. And to Brendan's earlier point around what we see in the future, I think so much of it depends on what happens on distribution, right? Who ends up in control, so to speak. We think back to some markets and think of it as sometimes economically inevitable, but it's often not. Certain actions that Valve has done, or that Apple and Google or Epic have done, have shaped the market significantly. And sometimes those choices were not arbitrary, but they were specific. There wasn't some type of fate that was destined of how that market would play out. So I think similarly in the game industry, we look at pressures from Valve, but also Xbox and Game Pass, and we see the consolidation we've had of publishers. The distribution model and the degree to which, for example, Apple and Google have such a dominant force in the game industry, even though it's tiny, their domination on the app stores is a significant factor in all of the game industry. So I think that one of the questions will be, I agree that we'll see consolidation for there to be the other side of that, there need to be platforms and distribution mechanisms that get those games out to people. And that's one of the challenges. If you could have these short form, are you going to publish all of those? I know the answer for Liminal is not, but that's right. It's like, are you going to publish all of those onto Steam as chapters? You have to build a new distribution platform. Gamers are gamers, man. I love y'all. I'm one of you. But getting someone to be like, I'm going to install this other app against games outside of some of these platforms
Extremely
has been
different.
often a challenge. So I think there's as much of a challenge of the platforms on which we distribute these as there is even the creation side.
One of the things we really talk about for creators on the Liminal platform as it grows is this notion of individuals, and they're individuals who team up, and there are like groups, and they can be composed of the same people. And I could be Justin Timberlake. I could be like doing a duet with someone. He comes from a group that we all know. And so those are structures that we think inherently, if we're going to offer people a way to tell their stories, there needs to be a way for it to be Brendan as the individual telling the story, Brendan telling a story in my world. And so Dave is publishing a story that features Brendan because he's got his following, I've got mine. And then maybe the four of us are going to team up and make a group called the Authors. And we need to know that the authors are composed of these four individuals. I really like Justin Timberlake, and I'm going to listen to his solo album because I've heard his work with his group. This is aligning with what you're saying, Aaron. There's a fundamental shift in how these products need to be presented, because ultimately it's like the person who's the creator is what we get attached to. It's why things like Twitch, I have the people I want to follow on Twitch because those are the people I feel connected to in the way they speak and the content they create. There's 10 people who stream League of Legends who are very famous. Like, why do I choose one or the other? There's a personality type, there's a content type. I think a lot of these platforms need to get smarter in communicating and sharing who's creating that content, what are the relationships to each other, and how can I connect with that set of relationships?
Yeah, it's interesting in the game industry how we've had mixes of this. Like, in some cases, you do have franchises that players follow. In some cases, you do have very well-known names of designers, whether they have worked with indie names or large labels, where you get a studio or other label that you're like, you build a relationship with. But the counterpoint is also whether we will, and again, this is yet to be seen, I'll see the TikTok kind of algorithm side of it, which disconnects one. I just want to play a game and I've got a feed that's being sent to me of whatever the game of the day is or the game of the week kind of thing. And in TikTok, you often lose a bit of the connection. So this is another aspect where I'm not sure which way games will go as we increase the amount of content we have. Who becomes the arbiter of that? Is it the channel provider, high profile authors themselves, or are they editors and labels and tastemakers? What are the roles that those are going to have as we see increased growth of content? This would happen even without generative AI. With generative AI, it's only accelerating the process.
Yeah, I think anytime you have a massive increase in content, the economic value tends to accrue to the aggregator that helps you find the thing you want, right? This is like the entire Google business model. They've taken the entire internet and said, we'll be the front end for it to connect everybody. And I think we already see this with these games. What is the one thing every game developer wants more than anything else? It's wish lists. Why? Because there's a Steam algorithm, and we're all worshiping at the altar of the Steam algorithm. We know that if we get enough wish lists to sacrifice on that altar, then Steam will put our game at the front. And if our game is at the front, it lives. And if it's not at the front, it dies. That is true for any medium in which there is significantly more content than the consumer could ever wade through on their own. It will become mediated by an algorithm. What's interesting is how, from a pure economic motivation, pretty much all major platforms have gone to trying to pull up specific pieces of content and disambiguate the creator. In the first generation of social media, we had Facebook and Instagram and Twitter that were very much, I follow an individual and my feed is the things those individuals give me. TikTok came along and said, there's more money to be made by taking just this thing. You don't have to know them, but if it lights up your dopamine, you'll stay on the thing. And then all of these other platforms chased it, and they all went to algorithmic feeds. Following somebody has much less value. I do think that what is really important about specific types of culture, and music has this, I think film has this, and I think games has this, and I think it's worth continuing to invest in this, is that I still have directors I will go to the theater to see their films. I think again, going back to the smiling curves, Hideo Kojima is way more valuable right
Right.
now than he has ever been. Because
Yeah.
in a world where all of this faceless content is just like, you just get inundated and you have no idea how to differentiate anymore, suddenly it's more valuable that you have an individual that you care about. And this is why we end up with super franchises. Game companies realize I know they will come by Assassin's Creed. I know they will come by Grand Theft Auto. And that kind of enduring brand value is the only thing we have left in a world where content is hard to differentiate on its own. It's hard to imagine a world where algorithms aren't necessary to mediate the discovery process. It's more than humans can do. But I also believe that, anybody who's I think every game developer at this point has taken that how to market your game on Steam course. What do they teach you, right? The algorithm is the end result. And I think they teach young aspiring artists this too. Mac Reynolds, who manages the Imagine Dragons, he gave a talk at the GamesBeat Next Thing recently, and he said the same thing. It's like they got started because they'd go for $200 and be like, oh my God, we got paid to do a show. This is the best thing ever. They'd shake hands with every single person in the crowd, and they would whatever they could do until they got big enough that they could get picked up. And now, of course, Spotify does the rest for them. But I think that there's always going to be that role for, like, how does the algorithm know this is cool? Oh, some tastemaker put it on their Instagram. Labubus exist because Blackpink, right? I think just to say it's inevitable, algorithms will mediate the games that we play, but communities that know how to discover and elevate the best stuff will always be important in seeding those algorithms. That's how you get breakthroughs, and that's always how you've had people. There's always been surprise directors, surprise artists, surprise game makers, and I hope that the world keeps making those.
Yeah, I think
So-
we have a certain obligation as people who have some sort of distribution channel to collect the right kind of data to make those algorithms feel good and useful. If you only like certain kinds of games, like if you couldn't go on a Steam and find only puzzle games, you would have a real problem, right? The utility of that platform would fall off quickly. And so I think one of the things we think about a lot are like, how can we help you find the things that you're interested in seeing? We have to be able to slice the pie that way. If we can't do that, then the sort of good feeling you get of that curated experience. How can we help curators curate content you want to see? Like, we have to be able to provide the sort of fundamental basis for that. There has to be that level of data points for folks to look at and easily communicate and search and sort and do all those things around. So I think it's easy to say, hey, algorithmically, we're not sure that's a healthy or a good thing. But I think a lot of that is based off like, what are the things we want to feed into that process?
So I think being subject to algorithmic tyranny is so pervasive in every single industry at this point. I keep thinking of both how to escape that and what does it look like to escape that. So to your point of getting to Steam, I come from not the game industry. For me, it was a shock that you do all of this fanfare, you sacrifice as many goats into the altar of wish lists, and then after that, you sit and you sit there like watching your tiny game with people come to life and see if it worked or it didn't work, right? At some point, you have to be hands off, and it's just the algorithm. It's so bizarre. I feel like the other current of that, which I see reflected also in social media. All of them, Facebook was follow people and then it took algorithmic slop. And it was increasingly hard to just stick to the people who you were following. And what I see is now a push towards, I want to be in a platform, or I end up hanging out in the places where it's just the people that I want to follow. So I end up spending more time in WhatsApp or in Discord because it's just like a much more created, much more I selected and opted in into what I want to see. And I think something similar happens with YouTube channels. I follow certain channels I really like, ignore the rest. If you look at games, a lot of the strategy is like you want these influencers or these creators to like promote your game before your launch. You get all those wish lists. It feels to me like these personas are the ones who have the keys of the kingdom at this point. The pressure that I see for game studios or game creators is that you are either forced to partner with these people or to become one yourself. If you take that to its extreme, if you take that in aside with what you were talking about, like the smaller team and being able to create, is the future going to look more like influencer creators? I have my audience that I'm creating towards, and I don't care about the algorithm. I'm just caring about building this little audience, and this is who I'm catering, and I know them well, and I don't have to be subject to anybody else's like tyranny. Is this like the route that we're following?
I think there's no such thing as making content and not having to promote it. I don't think there ever has been, and I don't think there ever will be. And I think it's getting more and more important that you can go direct and build community, like you said. I think if you look at why we make the choices we make, it often is because we're in some Discord or book clubs with the classic version of this, and we're all making collective decisions, and that's helping bubble up what's interesting. And I think as an artist, if you want to be a part of the cultural conversation, you have to be willing to go out and tell people your story. That will become more true over time and not less. And I point to examples of other mediums. Like Substack is, I think, a really cool innovation in the world of written text. Everybody thought that journalism was over because we had the ability to make infinite content and distribute it however we wanted. And then Substack found new ways to let people build brands around writing that were dislocated from having to be part of a major publication. That made for new communities, new types of writing, and new superstars in the world of writing. And I think the same thing will happen. Like the next Kojima will be able to exist because they're able to go direct and tell their story directly, but they won't be able to do it if they can't tell that story. There's no version of I just make a piece of content and I press publish and I hope the internet finds it. There's no algorithm that will do that for you. You'll always have to be out there telling people why your art was made, why it's a story worth partaking in. And I think that's a good thing. I think, again, that's what makes these human-centric experiences, right? Say what you want about the quality of AI for making games today. I absolutely believe that in 5 years, it will be better at it than me and my team. That's just the trend of these things. So for us, it's okay. If anybody can wake up tomorrow and type into a box, make me a game that feels like Time to Get with People, I'd like to believe that the reason that you'll come participate in ours is because you understand what we're trying to do for the world. You understand the story we're trying to tell, the relationship we're trying to have with our players, and the relationships we want to cultivate between our players. I think it's those things that will be more differentiating than ever.
So we're getting close on time, and I love the conversation that we've had because there's so many things that I think we have. The journey of the last couple of years, we've had some similarities in the opportunities, challenges we've seen. One that I want to call is that you said you didn't start out to make an AI game company. And here we are talking on an AI and Games podcast. I'm curious if you could share a little bit about that part of the journey, as much as you can. Share a little bit of like, you've talked about from like the player experience, a little bit of how your philosophy of how you're designed, but just a little bit of like your personal experience in that process, not starting assuming you're going to do it, and then what made you decide that it was worthwhile, what challenges have you had, and how has that changed your studio today in the couple of minutes we have left. There you
The
go.
Liminal story goes back to 2019, and I'll clarify that I always knew Liminal would use AI. So that was inherent in the concept for the business, but the motivation was never, oh, AI is hot right now. It was like, I had this thing I wanted to make that felt so important to make, and suddenly it was possible because of this new technology. And that felt like a real opportunity to go after. And so really it comes from a big D&D nerd, and D&D really actually changed my life in a couple of ways beyond just the fun of the game. I think it's really one of the most interesting exercises in understanding human creativity that's ever been made. And I'm just fascinated all the time by what D&D has done for the world. And my personal experience with it was I worked at Riot for 8 years. I started as a monetization designer. I ended up doing business development, corporate development. Whatever role I was in, though, more or less the company understood me as like a business guy. Right. And we've all worked at game companies. You kind of understand the role that the business guy plays in the studio versus the creatives. And I was happy with that because, oh my God, what a gift to be able to use my skills as a business guy to empower artists and creatives to make games like League that make the world a better place and make people happier. I was so satisfied with that role in life. But I did subconsciously believe I'm not creative. I'm not a storyteller. I don't make things. I use my very boring business skills to help other people make things. And that's what I'm here to do. D&D really shattered that because I'm now sitting in the room with my friends at Riot who are creatives, and we're telling stories, and my voice in that story is as powerful as theirs. And then when I was like, now I'm going to take my turn as a DM and I'm building my own worlds and I'm starting to go nuts, right? I've got notebook after notebook of like how the economics of this world works and why that makes this. And I'm like, holy shit, I might not be employable at Riot Games as a narrative writer, right? But I certainly don't feel like I'm not creative because I just spent all weekend writing stories. And that was a really important shift in my perspective on myself. And I think D&D doesn't get enough credit for the approach that they took that lets people feel that way. Because they took the really crunchy parts of game design, exactly how should I resolve a situation between a level 3 fire sorcerer who's using firebolt and a dragon. That is a hard question to answer, but they said, hey, we'll take care of all that. What you get to do then with all of that scaffolding is fill in your blanks around the motivations of your characters and why they're doing the things they're doing and why the world is the way that it is. And as somebody who's always loved games, anybody who's ever had that experience has thought to themselves, this would be really cool in a game,
Right.
right? The video game RPG really stems from that. But the RPG in games, really what it did was it made this trade-off that was inevitable, but I think terrible, which is it said, we are going to trade off all of the degrees of freedom that make tabletop gaming wonderful in return for giving you a 3D environment that we can build and create consistent rules for. So if you're playing Knights of the Old Republic, and it's a D20 based system, it's all those things, there's a limit to the stories that you can tell and the answers you get, because like somebody had to program every part of that behavior tree, right? But what is lost there is that feeling of infinite imagination that is present in the theater of the mind. And from 2019, when AI was very new, I don't think the phrase Gen AI was a thing yet. I don't think Midjourney had popped off. It was certainly before ChatGPT, but there were trends you could see, especially coming out of like the tech world, Silicon Valley, and like the concept there was like, hey, we're teaching sand how to think, and it's going to be able to make content. And if you believe in the general trends of technology, those things tend to get cheaper, better, faster, and happen faster than you'd predict. I believed that would converge towards the thing I wanted to do, which was give everybody in the world this feeling of being creative in video games. Fully formed from day one was the vision for Liminal. I want a lot of worlds that anybody can feel creative doing with no skills, and technology's got to somehow enable it. To your question of what have we learned and what's changed, everything has changed. Right? Not a single thing about the world of technology is the same now as it was when I had that idea. Brilliant technologists like Dave joined the team and we added other people. So much of our job in the first couple of years was just like, what are the tools today, but also can we make some predictions about what they'll be tomorrow? You don't want to pick the wrong stuff. That's why a lot of our design principles are around the player experience outcome. Because if you start to hitch your horse to the specific tech, like good luck, right? God help you in the speed that things are moving right now. But the really wonderful thing about video game storytelling is that you get a sense of what needs to be there, right? We need it from the beginning. Like if you were going to invite your friends to a one-man show in the theater, okay, you need a stage. You need to be able to do some sort of set dressing and stage design. You need some characters that you've written, and you need to cast them to look a certain way and act a certain way, right? You probably need a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then you need a way to invite your friends and get them to sit in the seats. And we're like, okay, let's make sure Liminal does those things. The parts of the stack that are driven by AI versus proc gen versus just good old-fashioned manual, whatever, can change over time. We try to be careful about not adhering to, oh, this is how Liminal does things, and more, okay, today, what's the coolest thing we can do for players in that set of jobs to be done, and then we'll evolve from there.
Dave, I'm curious, do you have anything to add from the integration?
Straightforward.
We've never...
One of the big principles we've always had is that we need to have a more fluid blend of these technologies rather than the single shot or double-barreled approach. One of the things we really try to think about incorporating is just traditional AI rather than just generative AI. There's a lot of opportunity, for example, where vector embeddings are very useful. You may ask generative AI to do a thing and you do the same thing in retail mage, right? Like I tell you what I want to say and you're like, here are the 3 flavors of what you get to say. There's not infinite choice. There could be a lot of choice. There are traditional sort of technology tools available to funnel that into a way that still feels good for the player, still lets them have their element of expression, but makes it viable as far as gameplay. We think about integrating with traditional machine learning methodologies. An example of that is if you want help generating a new character, we can know the distribution of kinds of characters folks make. And then we get to make a choice. Do we want the character we generate to be normative? Or maybe we actually want it to be outside of normative on the fringes. If you make a main character, we don't want your filler character to look like your main character. So we're going to actually push a little bit outside the normative range. The AI doesn't take away your creativity. Creates this thing where you're like, oh, that's not right. Let me dress it up the way I think it should be. We've elicited the creativity from you by giving you a starting point. We have this really big value of no blank canvas. I think we can use a lot of these other technologies, and by overly fixating on a subset of them, like generative AI, we run the risk of creating a full featured, really rich tool. I think you can see a couple examples. We've talked a lot about mesh generation. When we first started this project, we're like, someday. And now you look at Inzoid, you're like, oh, wow, that's a thing. You can very plausibly have that in your game, and people are doing it. The gameplay behind it's obviously pretty hand wavy when you look at Inzoid. Yeah, you can do it. Like, why would I? Or does it feel good? The technology is just moving so quickly. I think it's very important for us to have a degree of flexibility. And again, have an endpoint in terms of what is the player experience we're leaning towards, and how can we leave ourselves as broad as possible to the variety of technologies, because there will inevitably some technology we were not planning on, not aware of, didn't think was possible, that will likely happen within the next 2 years that will meaningfully change the shape of our project, and we want to be able to include it.
I've got a question for you, Aaron. When you were starting, did you have a specific, if this happens, we're fucked? Was there a technical innovation that kept you up at night?
Honestly, not that much, mostly because I'm skeptical. I do agree that things are moving fast, but the delta between seeing something in research or a demo and then being at the point at which you can get it in players' hands and they can use it and it's safe enough and it works enough and everything else is pretty big. So I usually felt there's enough of a difference there. That said, I do keep an eye on obviously what the major game engines are doing, providers there, because those tools, like some of it's just what I need to make versus not. If I don't need to make it, then why should I spend that energy? The one I get in debates on, and I think is fascinating, are what are called world models these days,
Yes.
and the degree to which, and that's a whole thing. So
Yeah.
maybe round 2 of this,
Episode
this
2,
podcast
world models.
is going to be
I've got
both like
thoughts.
the promise, because there are some really amazing things that I think can come from that. When I was at the AI Games conference in London recently, that was a big topic of conversation amongst people. But also, I think we're a long way from what I think would be the moment that's really ready for certain kinds of player experiences. Maybe it's a different type of experience. So yes, definitely keeping an eye. But as we all know, it's really easy to get an impressive demo and even some really exceptional research, but getting it to a great product, it's a great experience for a player, and it's one that's cheap enough and commercially viable. Those are very challenging.
Extremely challenging. There's a reason we have not yet seen an obvious winner in this space.
Yeah. Fellas, it's been a pleasure to have you here. This was fun. If people want to know more about you guys, if they want to follow, if they want to get in touch, how do they do that?
Liminal.gg, waitlist on Steam. You can also join our first look waitlist. We regularly add people to our private alphas for people who want to test the game themselves.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
David, Brendan, thank you so much. We'll see you in episode 2, World Models.
Can't wait.
Look
Can't
forward
wait.
to it,
All right.
yeah.
Thanks,
having us.
everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.
Thanks for listening to the full episode. We really hope you enjoyed the discussion. It would help us out a ton if you subscribed to the show on your platform of choice, as well as shared it with folks you think would find it useful. You can always check out playingwithinference.com to get in contact with us, join our Discord, or just find the links to the episodes. See you next week.